20 years after his infamous loss to Ali, Foreman did the unthinkable. At 45 years of age, Foreman took his title back, shocking the world and leaving little doubt about Foreman's place as one of the greatest fighters in history. The magnitude of this accomplishment cannot be understated. Foreman had pulled off perhaps the greatest upset in boxing, defying convention and embarrassing a multitude of prominent sports writers. How Foreman pulled this off, and the path he took to get there, are both equally astounding. Foreman's early career had been full of nothing but easy victories, until it wasn't. But it was the difficult path that Foreman had tread, the one that had turned from endless triumph to loss and failure, that gave the ex-champ the experience he needed to pull off the impossible. The Foreman that took back his title was a completely different man from the Foreman who had lost it 20 years earlier. To understand how Foreman took back his title at 45 years of age, we must first look at how Foreman used to fight, back when he was a young up-and-coming boxer in his prime. After winning the Olympics, Foreman arrived on the scene of professional boxing like an atomic bomb. He destroyed nearly everyone who had the misfortune to share the ring with him, usually within the first few rounds. He did this by using his natural size and strength to pile on relentless pressure. Funnily enough, half of the pressure was purely defensive. While unfairly known as a rough brawler who simply used power to overwhelm his opponents, Foreman was in fact an incredibly intelligent fighter, using a number of old-school defensive techniques to control the ring. Primarily, Foreman used frames, stops, and leverage blocks to stay safe and destroy his opponent's balance. In this clip, Foreman leverage blocks, straightening his arm to intercept his opponent's punch. A variation of this technique is called a stop. Here Foreman stops his opponent's punch by clamping down before he even has the chance to start throwing it. Foreman used these stops, leverage blocks, and even jabs to frame against his opponent's head and shoulders, his outlocked arms pushing or steering them off balance. It was these long guard tactics that led Ali to teasingly dub Foreman the Mummy. While long guard techniques left Foreman far more open than he would have been using a more traditional guard, Foreman was able to stay safe by being surprisingly agile for his size. When his opponents attempted to throw wide hooks around his outstretched arms, Foreman would deftly sidestep or duck away before resuming his steady march forward. This relentless, risky pressure style was perfectly in line with the image Foreman wanted to portray, and how he wanted to think of himself. Influenced in part by his rough childhood, and in greater part by his mentor and sparring partner, the terrifying ex-champion Sonny Liston, Foreman carefully cultivated the persona of an invincible juggernaut, cruel, uncaring, and mostly unstoppable. As Foreman climbed his way to the top of the heavyweight division, he picked up even more skills, adding wrestling techniques to control his opponents at close range and place them where he wanted them. I have it on good authority that most of these techniques were taught to Foreman by Archie Moore, the legendary cross-guard boxer with 132 knockouts. These new skills greatly helped Foreman in taking the heavyweight championship from Joe Frazier. Foreman moved the smaller man exactly where he wanted him for the duration of their short fight, winning the title in just 2 rounds. Another factor in Frazier's quick demise was a tactic that Foreman had used from the very start of his career. There were few better than Foreman at setting up power punches off of the jab. See how Foreman capitalizes on Frazier's preference to duck under his jab by following up with an uppercut. In this way, Foreman used the predictability of his opponent's head movement against them. Foreman's loose guard also meant his punches were especially hard to predict. He had a tendency to start many of his punches the same way and then change their trajectory midway to the target. What looked like a hook might actually be an uppercut, or a shot to the body may veer upwards to catch an opponent on the chin. These directional feints were something that seemed especially worrying to Ali. Nonetheless, after Foreman took out Ken Norton in only 2 rounds, a man that Ali had struggled against greatly, Ali was still ready and willing to fight Foreman. And Foreman, of course, thought little of the loudmouth ex-champion who lacked his size and power. The Rumble in the Jungle would become one of the most iconic moments in sports history. Ali used his speed to throw sharp crosses right through Foreman's open guard, and then out-grappled him against the ropes to tire him out. Foreman's wrestling worked to sap the strength of every other opponent he had ever gone up against, punishing them every time they threw a punch by throwing them widely off balance. But now Foreman came up against someone who not only used similar techniques, but did it better. Encouraged by Ali's endless taunting and his own coaches, Foreman threw everything he had at Ali until he had no more. The champion became so tired that in time he would come to wonder if he was drugged before the fight. Still, Foreman never doubted that he was only one punch away from shutting Ali up for good. But then, Ali capitalized on Foreman's exhaustion and sent him crashing to the canvas. With that one punch, Foreman lost everything that he had spent his life working for. For the first time, Foreman began to doubt himself and the careful persona he had tried so hard to cultivate. This was the beginning of Foreman's period of self-reflection, but at first, he would rebel. Trying to prove that he was still the man he'd always been, Foreman set up an exhibition where he took on 5 men in one night. His hope was to re-establish his persona as an unstoppable monster, forcing Ali to take a rematch. Foreman ended most of the fights via knockout, but what he hadn't counted on was that the public had not lost respect for him as he thought they had. Rather than see Foreman as a fearless warrior fighting against impossible odds, which anyone who has even lightly sparred fresh opponents one after the other knows he was, the crowd instead rooted for Foreman's challengers, seeing them as brave everymen going up against an unstoppable giant. Although Foreman made his point, the night had achieved the opposite of what he hoped it would. What did win people over was an insane slugfest with Ron Lyle. The Lyle fight proved that Foreman had what it took to move past adversity. Foreman got back from being knocked down again and again, standing toe-to-toe with a man almost as tough and powerful as he was. According to Foreman, at the time, he would rather have died than lose again. And although it cost him, he eventually prevailed. As time rolled on, Foreman convincingly put down challenger after challenger. It seemed that Ali would be forced to fight Foreman once again. That is, until the night that changed everything. Until the night that Foreman fought Jimmy Young. Early in the fight, Foreman had failed to press an advantage because the promoters had requested he make his fights last longer. But by the time Foreman wanted to end the fight, he no longer could. Like Ali, Young kept Foreman off his rhythm by flicking out a quick, loose jab, and then tied him up before he could fire off any shots of his own. Young went about this in a different way than Ali, sinking in deep underhooks to smother Foreman's punches. In the last round, Young sealed Foreman's fate by catching him with a right while he was off balance, forcing him to his knees, and scoring a timely knockdown at the very end of the fight. The judges unanimously called the fight for Young. The loss changed George Foreman forever, but this time, Foreman did not seek to re-establish his reputation. Instead, he embraced his loss. Foreman would soon explain to his friends that he had had a religious experience after the fight, that he had come close to death and had realized the fragility of life. Foreman took a hard look at what really mattered to him. He quit boxing immediately, eventually becoming a minister. After seeing the impact that his brother Roy was having teaching kids boxing, Foreman opened a youth center to help keep underprivileged kids out of trouble. But after someone he trusted stole a good portion of his money, something surprisingly common in the world of boxing and entertainment, Foreman realized he no longer had the funds necessary to keep helping his community. That was when Foreman made the fateful decision to return to boxing 10 years after he had lost his title to Ali. What's more, he vowed to once again become heavyweight champion of the world. As expected, very few thought that was possible. And it may not have been if Foreman hadn't gained the wisdom and maturity to take account of his remaining strengths and acknowledge his new weaknesses. Bringing back Archie Moore, Foreman became an apt pupil, mastering Moore's signature crossguard. Foreman used to control his opponent's jab by reaching out to stop it, catch it, or leverage guard. And this left openings that Ali and other fast boxers could take advantage of. Foreman's new crossguard took away these lead side openings. This meant that Foreman no longer needed to use footwork or head movement to evade his opponent's attacks. He would instead rely entirely on his size, his lead hand jabbing and repositioning his opponent, and his rear hand defending against jabs or lead hooks. At close range, Foreman no longer needed to sidestep and turn. He could instead move in close in a crossguard, and from there, he could either lean on those that tried to crouch, or use his forearm to lift their chins and straighten up their posture. Foreman could still manipulate their balance by cross-framing off of his crossguard, and this also provided a safe way to exit exchanges. With this new system, Foreman could control distance with very little effort. He would use his crossguard when he wanted to move in closer, and utilize his old long guard tactics when he wanted to create space or reposition his opponent. All this was backed up by an even deeper understanding of the jab than Foreman had before. Foreman now jabbed from all angles. Notice how he uses an up jab here on a crouching opponent. Here he uses a flicker jab to set up his right. And here Foreman pumps out two stiff jabs, meant to hurt his opponent towards the ring. A true mark of someone who understands their own style is that they know where their weaknesses lie. The crossguard leaves the fighter's body more open on the side of his high cross block, and his chin more open on the side of his low cross block. So notice how Foreman immediately takes advantage of this fact when his opponent tries to use a crossguard himself, catching him with a liver blow. This is why it's so exciting that Daniel Cormier, an MMA champion who uses a mix of long guard and crossguard himself, has gone to Foreman for boxing advice. While Foreman showed his opponents a great deal of mercy, calling refs over to stop the fight rather than wail on them as he had in the past, he also, at times, gave his opponents a taste of the near-death experience he had had after his bout with Young. As one of Foreman's competitors put it after quitting in the ring, "Man, I saw death. I wasn't gonna die in that ring. That was death." Eventually, Foreman had racked up enough victories to challenge the current champion, Evander Holyfield, for his title. Many viewed the contest as a joke, the last gasp of a dying man. Foreman replied to all such criticism with the quick-witted humor he developed throughout his years preaching, and determined to let his fists do the talking the night of the fight. As it turned out, Foreman's fists still spoke loud and clear. The first few rounds were surprising to most, with Foreman evading Holyfield's jabs and snapping his head back with his own. Holyfield's attempts at power blows with little to no setup made for easy counters. But in round 3, it was Foreman who largely abandoned his jab, giving Holyfield the chance he needed to steal the round. He countered Foreman's uppercut with a tight hook, and then unloaded 15 consecutive punches. Perhaps it was this late round success that made Holyfield think it was a good idea to stand and throw right in front of Foreman. Foreman used this opportunity to take the punches on his guard and move into close range. Foreman's close-range body blows eventually took a heavy toll on Holyfield, whose work rate and footwork slowed drastically in the 5th. Foreman's body punches convinced Holyfield to lower his guard, and it seemed that Foreman simply couldn't miss with his right. At that point, Holyfield's corner understandably told him to move after he threw. Holyfield largely ignored this advice throughout the 6th, getting wobbled with a hook near the end of the round, and then chose to stand right in front of Foreman again in the 7th. We can be glad he did, because round 7 became one of the most exciting in boxing history. A Foreman overhand right crashed into Holyfield as he tried to cut an angle out of the corner, and Big George went on the offensive, picking his moments to skillfully arc his right over Holyfield's shoulder. Holyfield had a tendency to lead with his head, and as such, had always found some measure of safety at close range. But Foreman's crossguard meant that Holyfield would simply bounce his head off of Foreman's elbow. Things looked great for Foreman, but then, all defensive options taken away, Holyfield did what so few of Big George's opponents had done before. He went on the offensive, throwing 20 punches in a row. Holyfield was taking advantage of the fact that Foreman couldn't counter well from his crossguard. As such, Big George was forced to adjust his guard as best he could until Holyfield stopped punching. And Holyfield wasn't stopping. Luckily for Foreman, the crossguard does a great job at catching punches halfway out, dispelling their force even if they do connect. Even throwing off an opponent's follow-through after they've already made contact can help take a lot of the sting off. Even so, enough punches hit clean that it was a small miracle Foreman was still standing at the end of Holyfield's barrage. After a brief respite, Foreman went right back on the attack, feeding Holyfield several of the same uppercuts that had finished Ron Lyle all those years ago. Now both men seemed too spent to do anything, and it was anyone's guess how the remainder of the fight might play out. In round 8, both men seemed content to take a break, Holyfield circling and jabbing and throwing sporadic two-punch combinations. Foreman simply marched forward, taking the brunt of the shots on his guard. However, in round 9, it was clear that Holyfield had recovered while Foreman had not. Holyfield scored two beautiful combinations which Foreman had no answer for, and Big George ended the round in deep trouble. But then, in round 10, Foreman surprised everyone one last time. A quick timeout mid-round to wrap Holyfield's glove gave Foreman an extra moment of respite, and Foreman put the spot of good luck to good use. He came out at a much faster pace, cutting off Holyfield's lateral movement with wide body hooks and goading him by dropping his hands. It worked, and Holyfield again stood toe-to-toe with Foreman. Both men landed, but in the end it seemed to be Holyfield who was most hurt, wincing and backing away. Big George knew a hurt fighter when he saw one, and landed a thudding 1-2 combination, forcing Holyfield to clinch. Too tired to follow up, Foreman would allow Holyfield to clinch for the remainder of the round, although he did land a final parting shot just at the bell. However, the last several rounds had given Holyfield an obvious lead in points, and it was clear to all watching that Foreman now needed a knockout to win. The 11th was much the same story, with Holyfield penetrating Foreman's guard with fast combinations, but eventually paying the price for standing too close to the fire. Midway through the round, Foreman countered Holyfield's right with a right of his own, landing what Holyfield would later describe as the hardest punch he'd ever been hit with. Returning to his corner, Holyfield had to ask if all of his teeth were still in, as his entire mouth had gone numb. The 12th was like a microcosm for the entirety of the fight. Holyfield outpointed Foreman by throwing quick flurries, adding on just enough punches to penetrate Foreman's crossguard once or twice before fading out of range or clinching. Foreman desperately tried for one last knockout blow, but Holyfield remembered the punch from the 11th and wasn't about to get knocked out the last round of the fight. He clinched so long that the ref had to forcibly push him off. As the clock wound down, Foreman landed the occasional bomb, but not the one punch he needed to put Holyfield on the ground. Finally, the final bell rang. Foreman had given his best, but after a tremendous fight, it was Holyfield that took the bout with a unanimous decision. Foreman lasting 12 rounds in a competitive fight with the champion of the world, a fight where he was on the edge of achieving victory several times, seemed to many to be an incredible last achievement of a highly skilled but aging fighter. Who could ask for more? Even if Foreman wanted to keep trying, when would another chance like this ever come up again? The world just didn't work that way. But then, astoundingly, Foreman did get one last chance. Holyfield lost to the undefeated southpaw, Michael Moorer, and Moorer was more than happy to fight Big George Foreman. Moorer viewed the fight as an easy win over a high-profile opponent, a tune-up fight that would still draw attention and add to his legacy. Foreman, now 45, had other ideas. The night of the fight, Foreman wore the same trunks that he had worn against Ali 20 years before. And as it turned out, Foreman would look far more the fighter he had been when he last wore those shorts. For instance, many were surprised to see that Foreman had completely abandoned his crossguard. Instead, he fought like the Foreman of old, pawing at his opponent's gloves and using long guard tactics to block and smother punches. There are a number of plausible reasons for why Foreman chose to do this, but perhaps the biggest was that Foreman wanted his hands to always be in position to counter, something near impossible in the way that he implemented the crossguard. The effects of Foreman's style change were apparent immediately. An obvious con was that Foreman was much more open, and as a result, a lot more shots got through his defenses than normally did. This was confounded by the fact that, in an open stance, where fighters have opposite feet forward, it's much easier to connect with your rear hand. The upside was that Foreman's right was finding a home as well. But the strange thing was that Big George's punches didn't seem to have the same effect on Moorer that they'd had on Holyfield, a man with a much better chin. To many watching, it must have seemed that age had finally caught up with George Foreman. Moorer's corner, Teddy Atlas, seemed to think this was the case. Atlas gave Moorer two pieces of advice. The first was to mix up his range. Excellent advice. The second was to relax, as he now had the full measure of Big George. But, as it turned out, Foreman's lackluster punches were all part of his plan. Over the next several rounds, Foreman's power remained bizarrely absent, but as he got into a rhythm, his boxing skills seemed to return better than ever. Like many orthodox fighters, Foreman could have been expected to do worse against a southpaw. Instead, the lead hand battle that comes inherently to the position fit Foreman's style perfectly. Moorer's head and shoulder were closer to Foreman's lead hand, making it even easier to manipulate his guard and knock him off balance. Moorer liked to sidestep and slip off his jab to set up a new angle for his next punch. But Foreman now used the extension of his own jab to help Moorer along, unbalancing him and moving him directly into his punches. The open stance position did mean that Foreman's rear hand was now usually too far away to effectively stifle Moorer's. However, Foreman could cross-frame with his rear hand on Moorer's lead shoulder, and this effectively shielded him from both hands as he exited safely outside. Besides, Foreman wasn't looking to be defensive, he was looking to counter. Although Foreman was a slower man, his years of experience helped him to better read punches, and he intercepted several of Moorer's rights with his own before Moorer even had the chance to extend them. These tactics, combined with a heavy dose of return jabs, ensured that even though Moorer might get off more punches, he would pay some kind of price for each of them. Building on his success over the last several rounds, Foreman began to pull down Moorer's lead hand to make way for his right. But despite Foreman's power punches getting through, Moorer maintained a comfortable lead on the scorecard, and seemed perfectly happy to trade with Big George. By the end of the fifth, Teddy Atlas had begun to sense something might be up, and implored Moorer to fight more cautiously, asking him to get his shots off first, and then immediately move out of range. Moorer ignored him. After Foreman tricked Moorer into ducking or slipping into several right hands set up off his jab, Moorer seemed to lose his cool. He decided to stand and slug it out with Foreman. Foreman took Moorer's punches and landed several of his own. To all watching, it now seemed certain that Foreman had lost his legendary fight-ending power. Then again, Moorer found himself inexplicably stumbling over his own feet the last few seconds of the round. In the seventh, Foreman switched things up by circling inside, the opposite of what traditional wisdom says to do against a southpaw. Because both fighters stood squared up at mid-range throughout the fight, foot position had mattered less than it generally would. But what did matter was the statement that Foreman was making. When Moorer moved inside, he was betting Foreman that he could still beat him with his superior speed. When Foreman moved inside, he was saying he didn't care. Although Moorer got the better of several exchanges, he also took a great deal of hard punches that he either didn't see or simply didn't care to defend. By the end of the round, Moorer's work rate had slowed considerably, and even though he had landed more punches, he was backing away. Moorer himself might not have understood why his body wouldn't do what he wanted it to do, but George Foreman certainly did. The eighth started out well for Foreman, the bigger man landing several right hands. This prompted Moorer to finally follow the advice that Atlas had been giving him about upping his pace. Late in the round, the champion found an opening and piled on, unloading on Foreman until the bell granted him a brief respite. Moorer continued his assault into the ninth. Foreman's tight, snappy rights kept making their way through Moorer's guard, but were barely noticed by both the audience and, oddly enough, by Moorer himself. It now seemed a certainty that this would be a repeat of the Holyfield fight, with the aging ex-champion coming close, but falling just short in the end. And worse, it seemed that Big George had lost the power that had given him a puncher's chance in the later rounds. In his corner, the great coach Angelo Dundee pleaded with Foreman to take charge, telling him that they were way behind. Essentially, it was now or never. And that was when Foreman showed the world the trick he had been playing all along. Foreman came out twice the man he had been the round before. His punches twice as fast, hitting twice as hard. For the first time, Moorer got a taste of something close to Foreman's real power. Now Moorer's head didn't just snap back, he was knocked completely off balance. Foreman only upped the pace, swinging wide looping hooks that stunned Moorer through his guard, and mixing in the same short, tight crosses that he had throughout the fight. The difference was that now they had weight behind them. Moorer backed up, no doubt just as confused as the spectators. The truth was, Foreman had been baiting Moorer the entire time. When Foreman had learned that there was no 3 knockdown stoppage rule, he had determined he could not show his full power right away. The last thing he wanted was to have Moorer survive several knockdowns and then use fancy footwork from long range to outpoint him the remainder of the fight. Instead, Foreman tricked Moorer into thinking he had what it took to go toe-to-toe with him, putting just enough power on his punches to hurt, but not enough to scare Moorer into taking a more cautious approach. If Moorer had suspected what Foreman really had left, he no doubt wouldn't have allowed himself to take so much damage. But now, Moorer's apparent prey had reversed course, barred his fangs, and charged at him full speed. With a minute left in the round, Foreman again caught Moorer with another tight cross. Stunned, Moorer backed up. Now was Foreman's chance. To quote the big man himself, "I threw a sharp left jab, then a strong right that caught him on the forehead and made my hand hurt. Not wanting to wail on him until he fell, I decided to bring the shot a little lower." Foreman's second cross perfectly turned Moorer's chin, and the champion of the world crumbled to the canvas, felled not by this one blow, but by the countless ones just like it over the last 10 rounds. 20 years after Ali had outsmarted Foreman to take his belt back, Foreman outsmarted Moorer to take his belt back. Foreman had used Moorer's pride against him, just as Ali had done to Foreman all those years ago. Big George stood in disbelief as the ref counted Moorer out, then fell to the canvas and prayed. His life had come full circle. Foreman's victory was the last echo of the greatest era in heavyweight boxing, a final triumph for one of the 3 extraordinary men who helped define a generation. One last time, Big George Foreman had shook up the world. This concludes the golden age of heavyweight saga. This has been David Christian from The Modern Martial Artist, wishing you, as always, happy training.